Hi, I'm Kamil Dean, professor in linguistics at Manoa. In this video, we're going to talk about how children learn language. So a big question that we often ask is, how do kids learn language? And the answer that we often hear when you just ask somebody on the street, how do kids learn language? The answer we often hear is, oh, they're sponges. They just soak that stuff up, right? You might have said that yourself at some point. And that's true, that they are sponges. They soak up a lot of stuff. That's why you should never swear in front of a kid. Believe it or not, they hear it, they internalize it, and they'll say it back to you at the wrong time. So they absolutely are sponges. But what I want to talk about today in the first part of today's video is that not only are they sponges, they're actually more than that. They're actually creative learners. So they listen to what you're saying, they soak up what you're saying, but then they create little rules and generalizations based upon what you say, and they add to language, sometimes correctly, sometimes incorrectly. But the point is that they're more than just sponges. And that's the first part of today's video. In the second part of today's video, I want to talk about sort of the flip side to that. In the first part, we're talking about how children can overcome the absence of certain things that they hear. They actually create rules and they insert grammar. In the second part of today's video, we're going to talk about how the environment that they find themselves in is actually very important. Just because they are creative learners doesn't mean that you can put them in a very impoverished environment and they'll be fine. It turns out that the evidence shows that children that are in really rich, stimulative environments end up learning language better, and therefore they have longer-term academic and lifelong success. And this has some real serious consequences to how we should raise children. So if you have children, or if you plan to have children, or if you know children, like nephews and nieces, brothers and sisters, then maybe you will learn something from this video, something that you can actually put to use. And the last part of the video will be some very broad, common sense kinds of tips that you could use to optimize the process of language acquisition. How can we make the process better and more effective for young children? Not very difficult, but this needs to be pointed out. So yeah, when you ask people, how do kids learn language? The thing that you often hear is, kids, they're sponges. They just soak it up. And that is, like I said before, that is absolutely true. Largely true, not completely true. Children are very, very sensitive to the language that they hear. But the point of this first part of this video is that children also do things that they've never heard before. So they're not just simply mimicking and learning what they hear. They're mimicking and learning what they hear, but then they're taking it a step further. They kind of imposing their own view of how language ought to be onto what they hear. And they create rules and generalizations that they then impose on their language. One piece of evidence for this is that children make all kinds of errors. We know that children make errors, and it's in fact one of the things we love about kids, the funny way they talk. It's really cute, it's adorable. In fact, parents often don't want their children to grow up because of the way that they talk is just absolutely adorable. Here's an example of a famous error, quote unquote error, that a child made, and children often make these kinds of errors. It's been reported that a child once said, "Mommy, don't giggle me," which is weird, right? It's not a normal sentence of English, but you can kind of see what the child means. The child means, "Mommy, don't make me giggle. Stop making me giggle. You're being too funny." So the question I want to ask is, why do children do these kinds of things? Why do they make errors of that kind? And what I'm going to lead up to is an experiment, a very famous experiment done by Jean Berko Gleason, and it's referred to as the WUG test. And we'll see how this sort of gets at the question of why children do at least some of the things that they do, and the things that we usually find very adorable. So to get to that, I want to talk very briefly about just some basic things about English. So how do you make words plural in English? The answer is really simple. What you do is just add s to them, right? It's pronounced differently in different words. So it's sometimes pronounced like an S, sometimes like a Z. So books, it's an S, but bags, it's more like a Z. That doesn't matter. It's basically an S, right? So you add S to them. You add S to a word, it becomes a plural. Add S to a noun, rather, it becomes a plural. So for example, if you say the word monkey, it means you're talking about just one monkey, just one animal, right? But if you add an S to that, monkeys, it means you're talking about more than one, right? Simple. So we can test, so it's a simple rule of English, but the question is, do children know that that's the rule? Do they learn that as a rule of English? Or do they just learn the word monkey and the word monkeys as two separate things, and they never connect the two? It's just, they use this one, the word monkey, when you're talking about one. You use the word monkeys when you're talking about more, but there's no real rule that connects the two things together. So we can test to see if children know this particular property. And then later, what Jean Berko-Gleason did was she tested to see if kids have the rule, which is what we're going to get to. So here's how you can test if children know the difference between monkey and monkeys. So you can show them a picture like this, and you can say to them, here's a monkey. And the kid will probably say, yeah, that's a monkey. Yeah. And then you say, now there's two of them. And the child will say, oh, wow, yeah, there's two of them. And then you say, complete the sentence. Now there's two, and you let the child finish the sentence. If the child knows the word monkeys, the child will say, now there's two monkeys. There's good reason to think that children wouldn't do that. After all, the child might well say, now there's two monkey, because there are many words in English where to make something plural, you don't actually need to have an S, right? Sheep, sheep. There are many sheep in the field. Or fish, there's one fish, there are many fish. You can do that, right? Or there's one grain of sugar. And if you have one grain of sugar, you say there's the sugar. If you have a whole bag of sugar which has billions of grains of sugar, you still say there's the sugar. So there's good reason for a child to think that there's no reason to add an S. But it turns out most kids, almost all kids, almost all the time, when you give them this little scenario, even at a very, very young age, they'll say, there's two monkeys. So they do seem to know it. But again, the question is, do they know that monkeys is monkey plus S? Or do they think that monkey and monkeys are just two separate things, there's no connection between them, and they just happen to have learned them separately? Well, Jean Berko-Gleason actually devised an interesting way of testing this. Okay, and what she did was she showed kids a picture of something that they'd never seen before. And this is the picture that she drew. Kind of looks vaguely like a bird, but it's got no wings. It's not really a bird. It's something that, nowadays people say it's a peep. Yeah, I think a peep is based upon a wug. This happened in 1958. That's when she did her first experiment. But what she did was she showed kids a picture like this, and she said, here's a wug. So a wug is a word that the child has never heard before. This is a picture of a creature that the child has never seen before. So it's all new. The child couldn't have learned any of this stuff from what they heard from the parent. So it's all new. So Berko-Gleason said, here's a wug. Now there's two of them. Now there's two, and then the child had to finish the sentence. So what would you say? Wugs, right? Yeah, I mean, you could say now there's two wug, no S, or, you could say there's two wuggia if you want, right? I don't know where that came from, but you could do that, right? But really, if you know English, you know that there's now two wugs. And she tested children, and it turns out that children often said, almost always said, there's two wugs. They knew the rule of English, even though they'd never had the experience of the word wugs. They'd never heard the word wugs before. And so what this shows is that children aren't just simply learning what they are exposed to. They're not simply sponges soaking up the language that they hear. They're actually internalizing what they hear. They're soaking it up. They're creating rules on the basis of that. And then they're applying those rules to every new piece of language that they're exposed to. The wug in this case was a new piece of language. But it wasn't like something that they did not know what to do with. They knew, all right, this is a noun. And because it's a noun, all of the rules that I've created that apply to nouns apply to this new noun. And so it allowed them to easily integrate the word wug into the rest of their language. It's a very effective strategy. It means that language acquisition is really quick and efficient because you're learning individual words, then you're developing rules, and then those rules help you integrate all the new language that you're learning. You don't have to learn everything individually and fully by itself because you've done much of the work with rules. So it's very, very efficient. So what this shows is that children are not just learning what they hear. They're learning what they hear, sure, yes, but then they're creating rules out of that. And in this case, the rule that they created was add s to make nouns plural. So if we turn to the stop giggling me, don't giggle me example, why does this happen? Well, it's the same basic idea, except they hear other things which give them a sense of what the verb giggle means. So they might hear sentences like this: the stick broke. And at some other point in time, they might hear something like, Dad broke the stick, meaning Dad made the stick break, right? Those are two good sentences in English. The stick broke and Dad broke the stick. And what they notice is that if you have a sentence like the stick broke and you have a sentence like Dad broke the stick, those two sentences are connected in that you can take the stick in the first sentence and you can move it after the verb. And when you do that, you can then stick in something into the subject position of that new sentence. And that whole thing changes in meaning. It now means the thing that you stuck in at the end is the one that made the stick break, right? So there's this little transformation that you can do to the stick broke to make it into Dad broke the stick. And that's a legitimate process in English. And so what children do is they create a rule of that sort. They say, if you have a sentence where you have a subject and a verb, at least in many cases, what you can do is you can take that subject, make it into the object, stick in another subject, and now you have this sort of someone made something happen meaning, right? That's the rule in English. And so if this is the pattern that children learn, when they hear the word I giggled, they can apply that exact same rule to this sentence, I giggled. So you take I, you put it after the verb, and then it has to become me. And you can then stick in a subject there. Dad giggled me, or Mom giggled me. And from there, you can then easily say, stop giggling me. Don't giggle me, right? So that's how we get this weird and cute error, don't giggle me. It's because children observed this sort of pattern and they applied it to giggle. Incorrectly, it turns out. That's cute. But you can see that the error, don't giggle me, isn't because they don't know what's happening. It's because they've noticed that other verbs in the language can do this. They can switch between the stick broke and Dad broke the stick. So this shows you again that children go beyond what they hear. The child never heard anyone say to them, don't giggle me. That's not part of English. But the child invented this. The child invented it because the child is using rules and applying the rules. Children love patterns and they love rules, and they will apply these things, sometimes right in the correct way, sometimes incorrectly. And that's why we get some of these errors. So it is true that children learn what they hear. And it is true that they figure out rules about their language. So they go beyond what they just hear. They generalize those rules to the rest of the language, sometimes correctly, sometimes incorrectly. But this is what makes children such fantastic learners. It's that they're learning what they hear. They are those sponges. They sponge up what they hear, but then they add to it. They do more than that. They create. They're creative learners. And that's really why children are the fantastic learners that they are. Okay, so that's the point of this first part of the video. It's that children are sponges, but they're more than that. They will add to the kind of language that they hear. So having said that children will add to the language that they hear, add to the language that their mom and their dad and their brothers and their sisters will say to them. It turns out that that doesn't make them self-sufficient. They actually still need help in learning language. They're great language learners, but there's a lot that we can do to help them. And the important thing, the thing that I want to focus on in this next part of the video, is that there's a lot that we can do to hurt their language acquisition. What the child experiences, the kind of linguistic experience that the child has as they're growing up, is very important. There's a famous study from 1993 by Hart and Risley. And what they did was they investigated children in 3 different kinds of households. The first was families that are on welfare. So these are families that are really economically struggling. They're at the bottom of the ladder. Many people are out of work. They're busy trying to find work. There's a lot of stress in the household. Hart and Risley wanted to see what the linguistic situation is for children being raised in this environment. They compared that to working class families. So these are families that have stable employment, but it's working class employment, right? So it's it's long, it's hard, people are very, very busy, but there's a lot more stability and there's presumably a lot less stress in the household of working class families. And this is then compared to professional families. Professional families also very, very busy, but they have the luxury of being able to carve out home work time. And when they're home and they can pay attention to their families. And when they're at work, they're at work, right? But there might be nannies involved, right? I mean, these are people at the higher end of the socioeconomic scale. They weren't the richest people in society. They weren't the 1%. That would be a whole different situation. But they were people that were well-to-do. What Hart and Risley did was they did lots of things. The thing we're going to talk about is they just measured how many words children in these 3 situations heard on an hourly basis. Simple question, simple thing to measure. They put little recording devices in each of these homes, and they just let the people do whatever they wanted to do for the whole time, and they recorded, and then afterwards they transcribed, and they went back and counted. And they counted based upon which kind of household the child is in. So here are the results. What they found was that children who are being raised in homes where the families are on welfare, at least one member of the family is on welfare, they heard on average 616 words per hour. Okay, that doesn't mean very much, but let's compare it to children who were in the working class families. So the welfare family home children heard about 3 million words per year. The working class family children, they heard double that, 1,251 words per hour, which is about 6 million words per year. Now that's an amazing difference, right? That children in these 2 different contexts are hearing such a substantially different number of words. That means the language being directed to these children is just very, very different in quantity. What about the professional class children? Turns out they also were double again almost. They were hearing 2,153 words per hour. So that's a total of about 11 million words per year. And what this did was it really added up over the years. So Hart and Risley tracked these kids for many years. In fact, this is just the first 48 months of their lives, but Hart and Risley tracked them all the way through past high school. But in the first 4 years, you see the trajectory is very different. You see that the top line shows you the children that were being raised in professional homes. They heard about 50 million words over the first 4 years of life. But the gap between them and the working class kids was very substantial. And the gap between the working class kids and the welfare kids was very substantial again. And so you can see that this gap between these different classes is really large at the age of 48 months, and it's just getting bigger, right? You track that onwards, that gap is getting bigger and bigger. You may say, well, so what? They hear less language. What's the big deal? Does it really have a consequence? Well, Hart and Risley also then tracked those children's vocabulary. So they'd go in periodically and they'd give them tests to see how large their vocabulary was. And they'd measure how many words they would use, how many different words they use in like everyday speech. What they found was that those measures of input tracked with the children's output. So this graph shows you that the children in the higher socioeconomic classes ended up producing far more words per hour and over the course of the first 4 years of their life than the children in the working class family. And they produced significantly more words than the children in the welfare families, right? So not only is it an issue of how many words they hear, that then translates into how verbal each of these children are. And you may say, again, does that really make a difference? Well, it does. The way that you express yourself, the way that you're able to express yourself, both orally and in writing, has a huge impact on your success. Think about yourself as a student in college. If you're really good at expressing yourself, you're likely doing well at college. If you're not very good at expressing yourself, you're likely struggling in college. And that may well be some of you, right? And one of the causes for that might be personality, it's true, but it might also be a question of how many words you've been exposed to and how many words you've been asked to produce over the course of your life. But here's the real kicker. Hart and Risley tracked all of these children, most of these children, all the way through high school. And what they found was these differences in production, in their vocabulary, tracked all the way through high school. So the children that were in the higher socioeconomic classes, even in high school, were more verbal than the children that were in the working class or the welfare families. And those first 4 years ended up being really, really predictive of this. So some families were in welfare for the first 4 years, and then a few years later, they pulled themselves out and they ended up doing relatively well. But those kids didn't benefit from that change in status later on. Those first 4 years during welfare, during the time when there wasn't much language being spoken to the children, had a lasting impact, at least through high school, and we presume beyond that as well. So that's a really eye-opening, that's what I was going for. It's a really eye-opening fact that the first 4 or 5 years of exposure has an impact that will last you probably the rest of your life. So it lasts all the way through high school and perhaps even beyond. So what's the conclusion from this section of this video? The amount of language that children hear is important. It has consequences. It's an indicator. Language is an indicator of other things in the environment. So for example, the amount of language that the child hears might be indicative of how much stress there is in the household. And maybe it's the amount of stress which is inhibiting children, not the lack of language. That's a possibility. Maybe it's a lack of other resources. Maybe nutrition is bad in a welfare home compared to a professional home. And nutrition might have an impact on a child's cognitive development. That's all true. Hart and Risley acknowledge that. I acknowledge that. You should understand that. That's all true. But language is certainly either a direct or an indirect indicator of something, and it's worth paying attention to. What a lot of people now think is that it's not just the number of words that children hear. It's more like the amount of interaction, verbal interaction, that children engage in. And that is actually a measure of the number of words you hear. If you have to interact with other people all the time, it means you're hearing more language. If you never have to interact, if you're left alone in a room for hours and hours a day, then you don't have to interact and you're not going to hear much language, right? So the number of words you hear is really a proxy for the amount of interaction that you get. And what researchers now think is that the amount of interaction that you get is really the thing that stimulates cognitive development. So in this third part of the video, what I want to do is just go through some very basic, obvious things that you and I can do whenever we encounter a young child. If it's your own child, if it's a child of a relative, if it's your future child, if it's a sibling or something, it all applies. So if you have children, or if you're around young children, or if you plan to be around young children at some point in your life, here's what you can do. And if you do these things, it will have long-term consequences on the life of that child. And I'm not kidding. First of all, talk to them. Seems obvious, right? Don't be afraid to talk to them. Just start a conversation about anything. It does not matter. Just talk to them. That's the number one message. Children are there to be talked to and to be listened to. So pay attention to what they say. Listen carefully to what they're saying and try to respond. Try to respond with questions. So whatever they say, ask them a question about it. Or if you can't think of a question to ask, say something that will take them in a different direction. That's stimulative for the child's mind, giving them new ideas, new ways to connect to what they have just said. That's the kind of thing that will develop the mind, that will develop the brain even. Narrate everything. This is, it's amazing to think that this has an impact. And you see some people doing this in real life. We often feel really stupid if we do it. But I'm not kidding, you should do this with young children, starting at the very young age, starting even as young as a couple of days old, all the way through until the child is 6 or 7 years old. It has an impact. And what I mean by narrate everything is you should not really let a moment go by when you're not engaged in conversation with a child. I know it's hard. Kids they talk your ears out, right? But it's good for them. It's like eating vegetables. It's what causes their mind to develop. So a lot of researchers have these really interesting recommendations. So here's one recommendation. For example, this is just to give you an example of what I mean here. When you go to the grocery store, take the kid out of the shopping cart. Instead of putting them in the shopping cart, facing towards you where there's not much to see, take them out of the shopping cart, hold them in your arm so that their face is at your level, right? So they can see what you can see, and you can turn to the child and you can look them right in the face, right? That is prime conversation mode right there. So hold them in your arm and push the cart with one hand. You got to be tough to be able to do this. So push them through the grocery store, and as you pick up the stuff that you need, you talk to them about it. So, oh look, here's some strawberries. Let's pick them up. Look at them. See? This is the child right here. Look at this. It's a strawberry. Can you say strawberry? What's a strawberry? You want to touch it? Smell it. It smells really good. Feels kind of squishy, but it's a nice, beautiful red. Turn it around. Oh, look at that green leaf. This is a green leaf. You want to pull that green leaf off? Wait. Let's pay for it first before we do that, right? You feel really stupid, but it's that kind of conversation where the child, I promise you, with big eyes is looking, and you hold the strawberry up to the child will try to touch it and try to understand it, but the child is listening. May not be understanding everything, but the child is listening. And it's that kind of behavior, if you do that day in, day out, it's exhausting. But what you're doing is you're giving the child a gift. And the gift is cognitive development. Point out new things to them. So even the things that you're not buying in the grocery store, you point them out to them. You say, oh, look, there's a mango. Mommy doesn't like mango. Daddy loves mangoes, but we're not going to buy them today. You want to smell it? Pick it up, show it to the child, put it back down. Just give them that sort of experience, the verbal experience and the tactile experience. Big one is this, it's really hard. Don't let them zone out on the iPad or the phone, at least not too much. I'm a parent. I know that, an iPad is a godsend. Sometimes you just need some peace. So yes, you do that sometimes, but don't let them do that. Don't let yourself be tricked into the idea that it's interactive. It isn't interactive. It's interactive in a very superficial kind of way. But what children need is not that kind of touch interaction. What they really need to get the kind of cognitive development that we're talking about is verbal and social interaction. So if the iPad is going to be part of your life, you should make it a three-way conversation between you, the child, and the iPad. And that means you can't just zone out. You have to let the child interact with you and the iPad, but include some verbal interaction. I know that's a hard one, but that's an important one. Reading to children is incredibly powerful. And that's because it's additional language, but it's a different kind of interaction. What the child is doing is interacting with your words and this object, which has pictures and pages and tactile feel. And as you're talking and the child is connecting it to the pictures, it's a different kind of stimulation. And that helps with the child's verbal understanding, right? But also other kinds of cognitive development. But again, it's just a different kind of interaction that you're giving the child. Tell narratives. When you get home from a long day of work, don't just sit down on the couch. Tell the child what happened during the day. Try to come up with an interesting way of saying what happened. Give some drama about what happened during your day. Tell jokes about what happened in the day, but give the child some sort of narrative. Kids love stories. And if you can tell a story every day, or last thing at night before you go to sleep, tell the child a story. They love those sorts of things. And that gives them this sort of cognitive stimulation that they need. The basic point is that you want to give children meaningful, interactive opportunities to experience new kinds of language and to connect that language to new kinds of experiences. That's what's going to really drive their development. It's difficult, but trust me, you're going to be doing them a long-term favor. This will last them the rest of their lives. It's a difficult thing for a parent or a sibling or an auntie or an uncle or a grandparent to do, but it's what leads to smart kids, and that leads to smart grown-ups. That's what we want in society. So wrapping up, what have we seen in this video so far? Well, we saw that children learn words and rules and creatively apply rules, right? That shows that they go beyond what they hear, and that's useful. We also saw that children are negatively affected or positively affected by the quantity and quality of language that they experience. Thirdly, we saw that these experiences aren't just things that we can note. They have long-term impacts on academic success in high school and beyond. And so it's important for us to pay attention to these. So what can you do? You can talk to children, you can listen to children, you can read to children, you can play with children, so long as there's language involved as well. You do this with children, and what you will be doing is you will be giving them long-term academic and life success. And that's a gift. It's a gift you can give to a child. And it just makes you closer to your child. Your child will love it. Your child will love you if you eventually have children. It's been shown to be successful. So, in closing, the next time you see a child, talk to them. Tell them a story. Tell them a joke. Laugh with them. Interact with them. Do something that will make them verbally stimulated. And if you do that, you're going to give them something that will make them cognitively stimulated. And that just makes them smarter people. I hope this video has been helpful. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, email your instructor, and we will be sure to answer your questions. Good luck with the rest of this course then.